I've known Michael Walsh for many years. His Devil's Pleasure Palace and Fiery Angel were actually the books that inspired AFA to have a book discussion group, which incidentally met right over there. Fabulous books, and then several others, but the more recent one, Last Stance, thank you, Why Men Fight When All Is Lost, really played a role in my thinking about this conference. Why men fight when all is lost. Last Stands, why do they do this? What are the traits of men, and why this is such an important element of our sense of selves as a nation and our national security. So I reached out to Michael many months ago. Turns out he was in Ireland, but persuaded him to come from Ireland to join us today. So please welcome Michael Walsh.
What part of Ireland? Is that what I heard someone say? Yes. I've come to you directly from the west coast of Ireland in the beautiful County Clare. The reason I'm there is 50 years ago last fall, as a 23-year-old lad, I went back to Ireland and reconnected the families that had been separated from 1932 until 1973. And in so doing, I conceived the mad notion that I gotta get me one of these when I saw the beautiful setting in which my great-grandmother had been born. When I'm looking out my dining room window, I can see the Cliffs of Moher, which you've all heard about. I can see the Atlantic Ocean. I can see the 3 Aran Islands, 1, 2, 3. I can see more of the Atlantic Ocean. I can see Galway Bay, and I can see on a clear day, which is almost never in Ireland, the hills of Connemara. So I have Irish friends who come over and they say, you know, there are 6 sites people come to Ireland to see, and 5 of them are right outside your window. So I'm very happy to spend as much time there as I can, but Karen was so persuasive, as you all know, that she managed to convince me to take a 23-hour door-to-door journey on Wednesday to be here with you today, and I'm very happy that I am. And so thank you all for coming. You know, when I started thinking about masculinity, which has been the subject of Last Stands, as Karen mentioned, and in my new book, which will be out next year, called A Rage to Conquer, 12 Battles That Changed the Course of Western History, I thought, well, you know, I need to open a light, because there's going to be a lot of bloodshed in this conversation. And some 4-letter words, so trigger warning, just in case anyone's offended, by General George S. Patton, Jr., who I will be quoting at some length. So I talked to my friend Bruce Fierstein, who is a dear, dear friend of mine. You all may know Bruce from the screenplays to GoldenEye, The World Is Not Enough, and Tomorrow Never Dies, the 3 Bond movies, but also for his book, Real Men Don't Eat Quiche, which was a huge, huge success for him back many years ago now. But so I said to Bruce, give me something funny about manhood. So Bruce, of course, did, and here it is. He said, there was a time when men were men, and they understood it was their job to protect the women, haul in the crops, fight crime, and save the French from their own worst instincts every decade or so. Even today, in 2024, a real man's idea of a safe space is the cockpit of an F-18. And the trigger warning, drop it or I'll shoot, still makes the case. And when a real man talks about intersectionality, he's only referring to one thing: the place where the 10 meets the 405. And that's the truth. The title of my talk is Duty, Honor, Courage, which is derived from General MacArthur's famous address at West Point some 60 years ago or more, when it was duty, honor, and country. And these are 3 words that are emblazoned into the hearts of every American boy, certainly of my generation, who grew up in the 1950s. Yes, Harry Truman was the president when I was born, and then into the tumultuous changes of the 60s. And MacArthur made that speech because he had been so closely associated with West Point, and also because he, through dint of, in my view, incredible luck, emerged as the hero of World War II, even though he did very little to actually win World War II, since he sat it out mostly in Australia. But we'll leave General MacArthur to his own devices. I should mention that I was born on the United States Marine Corps base of Camp Lejeune, and I drank the water too, by the way, in 1949, in October of 1949. And about 8 months later, the North Koreans invaded South Korea, and my father, who was at that point just turned first lieutenant in the Marine Corps, was called up basically into service and landed at Incheon in September of 1950. Now, he was 24 years old, and he got off the troop transports at Incheon and was immediately hit by a grenade, a concussion grenade that blew him several feet in the air. And he did what my father always does. He got up and killed whoever it was that had thrown that grenade at him. When they landed at Incheon, they weren't landing on a beach. It's not like World War II. They were landing on concrete piers. And the boats had been sold to the Japanese after the war as surplus because we didn't think we would ever have to fight again. And the Marine Corps was in danger of being disbanded. There was a great movement to get rid of the Marines because they were kind of an anachronistic embarrassment in the post-World War II era. So that they had to go up makeshift wooden ladders and jump off the thing and then land and then fight. So he fought, and he fought all the way to Seoul, which was a battle that he still won't talk about, and then he got all the way up to the Yalu River at the Chosin Reservoir when 100,000 Chinese attacked over the line and caught the Americans by surprise and had 3 nights of hell as they fought off this brutal assault. But the Marines stayed together, and they made their way back to one of the coastal ports on the east coast of Korea. It's a battle that's honored in Marine Corps history for good reasons. And then he came home and raised me. So you can imagine the kind of upbringing I had. At one point, he set up a little makeshift boxing ring. I think I was about 10, and smacked me around a good deal. Another time, we set up a kind of a straw tackling dummy and learned how to eviscerate it with a bayonet. Not many kids grow up that way, so it's possibly skewed my perception, although, as some of you know, I later went into a very unthreatening profession of being a classical music critic for 25 years, and took a lot of hate mail but never got shot at. Anyway, I did that for 25 years, the last 16 of them for Time Magazine, and the last great days of Time Magazine. So I can tell people that while I was at Time, I was there when Chernobyl blew up. I was in Russia when Chernobyl blew up, and I was at the Berlin Wall when it came down in November of 1989, which was the biggest block party since the liberation of Paris, minus the wine and the girls. So, but otherwise it was great. Now, the other thing I was thinking of as I was planning this talk was there's a meme going around right now. It shows a couple lying in bed, attractive woman, and the man next to her, and he's rolled away from her, he's on his side, and she's kind of looking at him this way, and she says, her thought balloon is, I bet he's thinking about other women. And his thought balloon is, in ancient Rome, would I have been a Caesarian or a Pompeian? And people have suddenly noticed that young men are thinking about the Roman Empire. Well, I think about it all the time. In fact, I've just done another book in which Caesar plays a very important role in one of the chapters. So what is it about the Roman Empire that is now looming large in the imaginations of young men? And Bill Whittle made this point quite eloquently, is that the current generation has never been through anything in terms of an existential threat, where if we're under attack from within right now rather than from without. But what did the Romans prize? They prized masculinity, obviously. The men were raised, they were taken away from their mothers once they got to be about 10 or so, and then they were raised to be warriors and statesmen. This is in the upper classes, of course, or equestrians, or knights as we call them. They were raised to be future leaders of the Republic. I'm talking about the time of Caesar right now. They were raised to show bravery, show courage, never to complain, no matter how difficult things were, not to whine, and to fight to the end. At the Battle of Cannae, which was fought by the Roman legions when it was a republic, the Romans lost, by some estimates, 75,000 men in one day. By the sword. They didn't get killed by an A-bomb. They got killed one by one by Hannibal and the Carthaginian combined armies, because they were outmaneuvered by Hannibal. They got caught in a double envelopment, a pincer, and squeezed to death like by a python. When they found their bodies, they found Roman men face down in the mud where they had suffocated, but with the nose of one of their opponents or his ear chewed off, that they never stopped fighting. And even though they knew they were doomed because of the strategic situation, they continued to fight. That's the way the Romans raised boys. Needless to say, that's a lost art. But living the good life as a man, we're not talking about women in this particular talk, was you showed virtu, which is a combination of vir from man, and all the masculine traits, bravery, courage, etc. The Roman Empire fell for many reasons. In the West, 476. In the East, it went on for another 1,000 years. It fell for many reasons, but the principal reason that I've determined after writing now 2 books on this subject is that their women stopped having children. That did it. If you read Gibbon, and I have read, yes, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in its entirety, and just because I thought that was fun, I just read War and Peace the other day. The men, in Gibbon's phrase, by the 5th century, had turned either effete or effeminate, and it's one of the great scorn words in the Gibbonian view of what happened to Rome. Yes, Christianity weakened it. In fact, the Roman Empire basically was a hostile takeover by Christianity of the Roman Empire. That's the short version of what happened there. But the women began to not be interested in having children. The reason that Rome came back from Cannae, they lost 3 battles in a row, Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae. The women were churning out children so they could replace those legions practically overnight. And while Hannibal stayed in the Italian peninsula for several years, he was never able to march on Rome. They bottled him up. They finally drove him away, and then they sent troops to get him in Africa or somewhere around the Mediterranean littoral and drove him to his death. But it was, and the Romans will admit this, it was because of the fecundity of their women who had the primary job of replacing the legions. That's it. Not self-empowerment, not girl boss, None of that stuff. The Roman matrons were proud of their sons, and they sent them off to battle without a second thought. They knew there was a high chance that they would be wounded or killed, but it was their job to replace them. And this is the attitude of why that particular empire lasted 1,000 years in the West. But when they became effeminate, when you look at the last end stage of the Roman Empire, which falls in 476 in the West, you have a succession of emperors, you have a succession of scheming. The emperors were bad enough after Marcus Aurelius, which is where Gibbon starts his story, because he's really talking about the decline of the Roman Empire. And they were no longer able to function. The political system cracked because the men were effeminate, the women didn't have children anymore, they were being invaded on all sides by barbarians, mostly Germans, but others. And the center was not able to hold. So we have to think very carefully about how we treat our men. Ladies, I'm talking to you. Because men do need women in their lives, obviously, for multiple reasons. And something that Bill mentioned that struck me too is, we'll take care of you and everything else. All we need is for you to take care of us. That's it. Don't question us, don't nag us, don't bark at us, don't blah, blah, blah. Also, we're not multitaskers. One thing. What's the objective? Go to Berlin and kill Hitler. Okay, I'm going to do that. Yeah, well, don't forget to pick up, no, I'm not going to pick up groceries on the way to Berlin to kill Hitler. I'm going to bloody well kill Hitler or die trying. Then when I'm done, well, we'll talk about it. That's the way men think. This famous parable, as we look at what society is doing now, called Chesterton's Fence. You all heard of Chesterton's Fence? This is very important, and I want to quote it. G.K. Chesterton was a Catholic apologist, and apology doesn't mean sorry, I offended you, it means advocate for in the classical definition. He wrote in a book called The Thing, actually, in 1929, The Drift from Domesticity, and he says this: there exists in such a case of reforming or deforming society a certain institution or law, let us say, for the sake of simplicity, a fence or a gate erected across a road. The more modern type of reformer goes gaily up to it and says, I don't see the use of this, let's clear it away. To which the more intelligent type of reformer will do well to answer, if you don't see the use of it, I certainly won't let you clear it away. Go away and think. Then when you come back and tell me that you do see the use of it, I may allow you to destroy it. In other words, we have so turned on tradition that we think it's all useless. It's bunk, as Henry Ford famously said, that the barriers to civilization has erected against threats that are maybe invisible are no longer respected, because this current generation, which is coming of age now and moving into power, has never experienced what happens when you tear the fence down and Godzilla comes through, or the barbarian hordes, or something. So we have to be very careful when we build a new society that we are not tearing down Chesterton's fence. And you all know, because you're all on the right side of the issues, and the right side of history, I might add, that barriers are there for a reason. They're experiential obstacles to help preserve you. And it's suicidal to tear them down without understanding why it's there in the first place. I've been in many Hollywood meetings in the last 10, 15, 20 years, and everything has changed about Hollywood, but One thing that hasn't is still the wokeism that's affected it, or infected it. And I would hear from female executives, we want something that breaks barriers, that pushes the envelope. This is why you have Netflix, for example. And all those shows, you know, the ones that you don't watch, those get made because it's virtue signaling to push barriers that don't need to be pushed. It's why you have all these transgressive, active, transsexual propaganda, because that's a barrier that needs to be broken. And where does all this come from? Critical theory. This is two words that haven't been mentioned so far today, but I wrote a book that Karen mentioned in her introduction called The Devil's Pleasure Palace, which is about the cult of critical theory and where it came from and what it wants to do. And very briefly, critical theory means this: everything should be questioned, attacked, and destroyed. That's it. And critical race theory comes from critical theory. The cultural Marxism that the left tells us on Wikipedia, so it must be true, that it's a right-wing conspiracy theory comes from critical theory. And I was asked after The Devil's Pleasure Palace came out, well, okay, so let's say they want to tear down everything, then what do they do? And I say, nothing. Nothing. They're nihilists. It's like that scene in The Big Lebowski. Don't pay any attention to these men, Donnie. They're nihilists, John Goodman says, then throws the bowling ball and hits one of the bad guys right in the crotch. The nihilism should not be underestimated, because they really are happy to kill themselves if they can take us with them. I've come up with a couple of aphorisms that I put on Twitter, now that I'm back on Twitter. Thank you, Elon. Thank you very much. After I got sent to Siberia for a while. A woman should no more die on the battlefield than a man should die in childbirth. Seems to me to be unexceptionable, but apparently not. Another one, this is apropos now of what's going on in the Ukraine. If women are fighting in your front lines, you're losing. Camille Paglia, in the introduction to Sexual Personae, made the following statement: if women were in charge of civilization, we would all still be living in grass huts. This outraged the feminists of her time, and she was a feminist of her time. There's never been a successful matriarchy. It's impossible. You argue too much with each other, for one thing, ever to decide anything. It's important to understand about men, for those of you who are not of the male persuasion. Billy mentioned this too. We're very simple creatures. We're like amoebas, right? We go in the direction of things we need, and we shy away from things that burn us. And women are always thinking, like the woman in the meme, I bet he's thinking about other women. He's thinking about the Roman Empire is what he's thinking about. We're not that complicated. And we're task-oriented. And to try to confuse us or make us seem that that's somehow inferior to the way females think is a fool's errand, and it's caused so much difficulty between the sexes now. En passant, I wrote a piece on my website that I edit, which is called the-pipeline.org. And we're out, it's mostly about energy issues, but we've taken on the global warming hoax and many other things. But I've been writing a series of pieces called To Save America Blank. One of them is To Save America, Repeal the 16th Amendment. That's the income tax. Who's for that? Yeah, everybody raised their hand. To Save America, Repeal the 17th Amendment. Yeah, we got to get rid of that one too. To Save America, repeal the 18th. Oh, we did that, didn't we? Yeah, we repealed the 18th Amendment. And finally, to Save America, repealed the 19th Amendment. Women shouldn't vote. I knew that would get a rise out of you. I'm still getting hate mail about that one. And it's not the time to go into the background of the 19th Amendment, which is very similar to the background of the 18th Amendment. It was effectively Protestant Midwestern America's revenge on the immigrants that were flooding into the East Coast, who were mostly single men. And they were beginning to outvote the nativists. And the nativists realized if they could get their wives to vote, the wives, of course, would vote exactly the way they were told, and they would therefore keep a political majority. Well, that didn't work out either, did it? And finally, a realization I had researching my most recent book, if women feel unprotected by their men, they will defect to the enemy immediately. They will not fight. They will not fight. I'll give an example. In 1097, the Crusaders had left Constantinople. This is the Prince's Crusade now, so it's Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond de Saint-Gilles, and Bohemond and Tancred. And they are marching from Nicaea, where the famous Council of Nicaea had taken place 700 years earlier, towards Jerusalem. But they had to go through Anatolia, which is today Turkey. And they divided themselves into two segments, and one followed another at some distance. So Beaumont of Toronto, who was a Norman who had come from the Normans, we know that in 1066 they conquered England, but they'd also conquered a lot of the Mediterranean, including parts of Italy and Sicily. So Beaumont had grown up and was born in Toronto in southern Italy. He and his nephew Tancred were leading the avant-garde when the Turks ambushed them. The Crusaders had never encountered Muslim warriors up to this point. And the Crusaders were big, strong, they were much bigger than the Turks physically, and the Turks were afraid of them. They had heavy swords. They could cut a man in two, literally, with a broadsword. They rode big horses that were also partly armored. Those are called cataphracts. Their horses were big. They were big, slow-moving, but very violent people. And the Turks were more like American Indians. They would attack. They had these little bent composite bows. If you saw one, you'd recognize it. They'd rush up, they'd shoot, and then wheel and turn away. So the Crusaders were frustrated. They couldn't engage these people. And as it happened, they pushed this the advance guard of the Crusader army back into some marshy area, and they were outnumbered by a huge factor, and they were beginning to fear that the crusade almost ended right now. And so they formed a shield wall, which is what military tactics of those days would dictate. So the knights outside with their shields, taking a pounding from the Turkish warriors who they couldn't get back at. And at one point, the Turks broke through the lines and got into the middle, which is where the women, children, camp followers, hookers, they took an amazing amount of extra people with them on this crusade, by the way. And the minute the Turks did, the women who had up to that point been dragging away bodies from the front, getting water for the troops, because it's very hot, and you're not in armor like a later medieval knight, but you're in chainmail, and you're fighting, getting water for the troops. You know what the women did? They changed into their sexiest outfits, and they said to the Turks, "Take us to the harem." And then Bohemond, who's the hero of this chapter of mine, saw this and came in with his sword and cleaved several of the Turks in half. And then the women felt safe again. And they took off their finery and went back to getting water for the troops and dragging away dead bodies. So, and this happens repeatedly, by the way, throughout history. Women who lack male protection will always go over to the enemy. because they follow the big dog and they follow the strong horse. These are not comfortable truths, but they're true truths. If you ever read, what is the name of that book that they made into a movie as well? Cloud Atlas. The scene set far in the future in Hawaii they call true true. It's not only true, it's true true. Well, this is true true. So I want to talk now for the remainder of the talk about the nature of warfare, in part because I was raised in it, and also in part I've now become a historian of it. And let me just say this. War has been an essential part of the human condition as long as there has been a human condition. Kant, famously in an essay, makes the point that war is the natural state of man, peace is the exception and the aberration. And you must understand that, or you will always be taken by surprise. There's nothing human about it, inhuman about it. It's the principal agent of societal change, waged by men on behalf of and in pursuit of their gods, their women, and the sheer joy of combat. And don't underestimate, men think hitting each other is fun. And getting hit is fun. We don't see it as violence, we see it as fun. And one of the earlier speakers showed, women see a man chucking a kid up in the air, and they think he's thrown him 75 feet in the air. We think this is fun. Teasing our sons is fun. Taking them and teaching them how to box is fun. Taking them and teaching them how to eviscerate the guy next door with a bayonet is fun, let's face it. Don't knock until you tried it, right? In pursuit of their gods, their women, and the sheer joy of combat, and in so doing to impose their will upon other men through extreme violence. That's the way men are. When we get together, you take a group of strange men, even if, say, a pickup basketball game, they immediately sort themselves out. There's no debate. This guy's tall, he's going to be the center. This guy's this guy's this guy's this. Go. They elect leaders almost spontaneously. Okay, clearly one guy is the big dog in this group. He's the leader, he's the smartest guy, he's the strongest guy, whatever. Boom, it's done. There's no discussion. It just happens. Destructive though it is, and must necessarily be, war is a primary engine of both scientific and cultural progress. Without warfare, you don't have anything. You don't have any technology. It's always in reaction. There's a yin and a yang between offensive technology and defensive technology, and it manifests itself later on in civilian technology, driving both external technology and the inner exploration of the soul through the arts. This is an area that I've decided to make my own insofar as I can, which is to always apply the arts to political things and warfare things, because they're very close. If you read, say, Torquato Tasso's La Gerusalemme Liberata, the greatest Italian poem after Dante, it's about the First Crusade. It's a number of love stories that he interpolates into it, but it's about fighting. And it was, as I said, the most important poem of the late medieval, early Renaissance, and affected so many things. But the artists get at this. I mentioned War and Peace. Half that book is war, and the other half's peace. And in peace, the aristocrats are thinking about who am I going to marry. The girls are thinking about who's going to be my suitor. They're, as you know, Hélène, who marries Pierre Bouzoukoff, turns out to be kind of trampy and embarrasses him the whole time. And in the end, he finally gets together with Natasha. But that's not, to me, or most guys, the interesting part of the book. That's the girl stuff. The men's stuff is about the theory of warfare. I have a chapter in my new book about Napoleon. And I become friends with Lord Andrew Davis, who is the Napoleon scholar, and was very helpful to me. And I read his 800-page biography of Napoleon. But when I thought about Napoleon, I thought, I'm not going to write about him as a general. Most of my stuff is about the commander of the battle. I'm going to write about him as an artist, which is how he saw himself. He was a novelist first. He was an artist of life. The Germans have a word, der ist ein Lebenskünstler. He's an artist of life. And that was Napoleon. So Napoleon then influenced who? Byron. There's an artist for you, and one who didn't care about social norms at all. Liszt, the great pianist, same thing. The Napoleonic influence of the man who's above morality in pursuit of his goal is felt throughout the 19th century. A world without belligerent men might be a world without war, but would we really want that? It's not an idle question. From the rise of modern feminism beginning in the 1970s, the feminine virtues have been gradually elevated over the masculine, and in a way to make the latter seem like defects, toxic, rather than the complementary half of the fabric of civilization. To quote Colonel Jessup, ladies, you want men on that wall. You need men on that wall. And that's written by a liberal, right? My theory is that most Hollywood liberals are actually conservatives. They just don't know it yet. Well, hey, it worked for David Mamet, didn't it? There's never been a successful society ruled directly by women, but to even suggest that such a thing is not possible quickly brings down the wrath of the viragos, termagants, and erenyis, familiar from the Greek tragedies, upon any unfortunate of either sex who dares venture such an opinion. History, however, is generally unimpressed with transient political thought. Western attitudes regarding the proper relationship of men and women extend back to and originate with the earliest voices in our literature. And who are they? There's two, the ancient Hebrews and the ancient Greeks. They're almost simultaneous. The Bible's being written about the same time as Hesiod writes Theogony, and the Homeric epics, 800 BC or so, become part of the foundation stone of Western literature. And those attitudes are inextricably tied up with warfare in the battlefield. The quintessentially unsafe space, and whose danger must be embraced rather than denied, regretted, or ameliorated. That space happens to be male. War is not a hobby, but a profession, not an option, but a duty. Such nouveau etymological nonsense is part of the modernist attack on masculinity, whether traditional or toxic, attributes that are, after all, the same thing. Faced with the wreckage of Pearl Harbor in the early days of the Pacific War, that would be December 1941, Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King, a famous, nasty, hard to get along with guy, newly installed as the Navy's commander-in-chief and also the chief of naval operations, which is basically the man who runs the Navy, observed that when the shootings start, that's when they send for the sons of bitches. And let me just point out, Bill alluded to this, I think, obliquely. Pearl Harbor was December of 1941. Midway was 6 months later. From seeing our fleet annihilated to the utter destruction of the Japanese fleet took us 6 months. We caught them in a trap at Midway, sank 4 or 5 of their battleships, of their aircraft carriers, excuse me, left the battleships alone because Nimitz, who was a genius, and another one of our Germans, by the way, he grew up in Texas, a part of the Texas German community, and spoke German until he was about 20, realized he could get them in a trap, and did, and annihilated them. And that's because President Roosevelt laid out very clearly in his speech to Congress, we will stop at nothing to win this war. The end. We're not going to be nice to them. There's not going to be a negotiated settlement. We're not going to respond proportionally. We're going to kill every last goddamn son of a bitch that we can until they stop fighting. And that's how men fight. In the main, men are natural-born killers. It's what we do best. It's nothing personal, Sonny. It's just business. the proof of which lies in the fact that throughout history, raw conscripts have been converted as rapidly as possible into the lethal weapons of the 10th Roman Legion, the Grande Armée, or Patton's Third Army. His formulation, that is General Patton's, remains essential and unequaled. No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor, dumb bastard die for his country. And if you've seen the movie Patton, which was written by Francis Ford Coppola, by the way, you'll note that the opening sequence of that is George C. Scott standing on a stage, the giant American flag behind him. And the historical origins of that scene are an address he made to the 6th Armored Division in England on May 31st, 1944. Patton, at this point, had been relieved of duty because of a slapping incident of a soldier, which puzzled the hell out of the Germans. Why would the Americans put their best general on the shelf because he smacked some soldier? But he was. And then Eisenhower brought him back to England and gave him command of a phantom army that was meant to fool the Germans into where we were actually going to land on the coast of northern France. But Patton had served in World War I. He was a tank commander at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel in 1918, September of 1918. It was the first major engagement by the American forces under Blackjack Pershing, in which they operated as a unit. And that was in September of 1918, and the war was over 2 months later. Because the American resolve, even though our troops were farm boys from Kentucky and like Sergeant York, or street gangsters like Monk Eastman, who fought with one of the New York regiments, they fought their way to victory for the Allies in World War I. And Patton had been there along with MacArthur, along with Pershing, who was the American commander. Harry Truman was in that war. Anyone who figured large in World War II was in France, except for Eisenhower, who was assigned duty back in the States. So that was a preparation. That was that 30-year gap between the First World War and the Second World War. So Patton is in front of these soldiers who are about to go into battle. And he knows they're nervous. I asked my father when I was interviewing him for the last chapter of Last Stands, at one point I said, "Were you ever scared?" And he looked at me like I was insane. Why would you be? You don't have time to be afraid. You know what he said? You go to work. It's a job. And you follow your training, and that's going to keep you alive. If you panic, you will run and you will be killed. If you follow your training, you have a chance to live, and you will be an effective soldier. So Patton is facing a lot of these brand new soldiers now, just before D-Day. And he says, battle is the most significant competition in which a man can indulge. It brings out all that is best and removes all that is base. Now, trigger warning, this is General Patton talking, and I'm going to quote him exactly as he spoke, not the sanitized version. And there's a reason for this. Besides, épater la bourgeoisie, that's part of my shtick, but I want you to hear what he said. You are not all going to die. This is true. Killed in action is a negligible part of your army. You don't, except at Cannae, where it was 100%, you don't judge victory by what percentage of your soldiers, your men, are killed or even wounded. An army that breaks, and Tolstoy makes this point very well in the Battle of Borodino, an army that breaks loses. You cannot run your way to victory. Only 2% of you right here today would be killed in a major battle. Every man is scared in his first action. If he says he's not, he's a goddamn liar. But the real hero is the man who fights even though he's scared. Courage is not recklessness. Nobody wants a reckless moron in the trench with them. They want a guy who wants to go home alive and will do anything it takes to do that. Some men will get over their fright in a minute under fire. Some take an hour. Some it takes days. But the real man never lets his fear of death overpower his honor, his sense of duty to the country, and his innate manhood. And that's something that MacArthur picked up on in his famous speech later. An army is a team. It lives, eats, sleeps, and fights as a team. This individual hero stuff is bullshit. The bilious bastards who write that stuff for the Saturday Evening Post don't know any more about real battle than they do about fucking. Why, by God, I actually pity these poor bastards we're going up against. Each man must think not only of himself, but think of his buddy fighting alongside him. This is a point I do make in Last Stands, that under combat, your primary allegiance is to the guy next to you. And this goes all the way back to the Greeks and Romans, that in the Greek phalanx, as perfected by Alexander but inherited by him from his father figure, Philip II of Macedon, on the assumption that everybody's right-handed, the guy on your left is protecting you and you're protecting the weak side of the guy on your right. And that's the way these armored units, these essentially armored units, operated under the Greeks. Still true, even though we're now in the era of mechanized warfare. We don't want no yellow cowards. We don't want yellow cowards in the army. They should be killed off like flies. If not, they will go back home after the war, goddamn cowards, and breed more cowards. The brave men will breed more brave men. Kill off the goddamn cowards and we'll have a nation of brave men. Sure, we all want to go home. We want to get this war over with. But you can't win a war lying down. The quickest way to get it over with, and this is an echo of a famous statement by General Sherman during the Civil War, quickest way to get it over with is to get the bastards who started it. We want to get the hell over there and clean the goddamn thing up and then get those purple-pissing Japs, because the Japanese had not yet been defeated. The quicker they are whipped, the quicker we go home. The shortest way home is through Berlin and Tokyo. So keep moving. When we get to Berlin, I am personally going to shoot that paper-hanging son of a bitch, Hitler. We will win this war, but we'll win it only by fighting and showing the Germans that we've got more guts than they have or ever will have. We're not just going to shoot the bastards, we're going to rip out their living goddamn guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks. We're going to murder those lousy Hun cocksuckers by the bushel fucking basket. Needless to say, this was highly censored in the American press reports at the time. Some of you men are wondering whether or not you'll chicken out under fire. Don't worry about it. I can assure you, you will all do your duty. War is a bloody business, a killing business. The Nazis are the enemy. Wade into them, spill their blood, or they will spill yours. Shoot them in the guts. Rip open their belly. When the shells are hitting all around you and you wipe the dirt from your face and you realize it's not dirt, it's the blood and guts of what was once your best friend, you'll know what to do. As an aside, when Spielberg was staging the D-Day landing, he had some military advisors, and he was training the guys, and they said to him, okay, now you're hitting the beach, and your best friend, boom, just evaporated, dead. What's your reaction? And the guys said, oh, geez, you know, he's my best friend, and oh my, he said, no, thank God it wasn't me. That's your reaction. And you go on. I don't want any messages saying, I'm holding my position. We're not holding a goddamn thing. We're advancing constantly, and we're not interested in holding anything except the enemy's balls. We're going to hold him by his balls, and we're going to kick him in the ass, twist his balls, and kick the living shit out of him all the time. Our plan of operation is to advance and keep on advancing. We're going to go through the enemy like shit through a tin horn. My men don't surrender. I don't want to hear any soldier under my command being captured unless he's been hit. Even if you are hit, you can still fight. Look at those Romans with the noses of the Carthaginians in their mouths as they both died. That's not just bullshit either. I want men like the lieutenant in Libya who, with a Luger against his chest, swept aside the gun with his hand, jerked his helmet off with the other, and busted the hell out of the Boche with the helmet. Then he picked up the gun and killed another German. All this time he had a bullet through his lung. That's a man for you. There's only one thing you men will be able to say when this war is over and you get back home. 30 years from now, when you're sitting by the fireside with your grandson on your knee and he asks, "What did you do in the Great World War II?" you won't have to cough and say, "Well, your granddaddy shoveled shit in Louisiana." No, sir. You can look him straight in the eye and say, "Son, your granddaddy rode with the Great Third Army, and the son of a goddamn bitch named George Patton." All right, you sons of bitches. You know how I feel. I'll be proud to lead you wonderful guys in battle anytime, anywhere. That's all. And that was the end of the speech. That's how men talk to each other. We don't talk that way, except I just did, of course, but I was quoting history, so it's okay. Like that in front of you. We respect women too much to talk like that in front of women, and it's not suitable conversation. But every man in this room understands what Patton meant. Is anybody not clear on the general's message? Patton then, to wrap this story up, was given command of the 7th Army and was on his way, after they'd crossed the Rhine, headed straight to Germany on an east-west line. And the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge at Christmas, in the last year of the war. And those were raw troops. They were members of the Screaming Eagles, 101st Airborne, that had been occupying a town called Bastogne. American guys didn't even know how to pronounce it. You see the videos on Bastogne, and we're on our way to Bastogne. And they needed troops there to hold back this last great push by the Wehrmacht. So Eisenhower called a conference, and Patton was there, and some of the other generals. No one could do it. The British couldn't do it. And he said, "We need X number of divisions by X." He said, "We need at least 6 divisions." And Patton said, "I can have 3 divisions there in 3 days." And he took an army in motion, which is a very complex creature, and turned it 90 degrees and went straight up, right into the teeth of the Germans, and broke the Wehrmacht's last offensive. And in doing so, won the war in the West for the Allies. But he did it with this attitude that he expressed in that speech to those young troops. So ladies, when you think of your men, think of them as warriors. They're out there fighting every day for you. It's so true that a man has to choose sometimes between his career and his family. And most men will choose their career because they have to. They want to put food on the table, they want to keep roofs over your head, and we sacrifice this because we love you. Not because we don't care, but because we do care. Thanks very much.